he told me, they know that's a problem, but it's too taboo to put in the book. And I was like,
whoa.
Bingo.
Flashing neon lights.
Yeah. For every federal employee who retires, that person is not going to get replaced on a one-to-one basis, right? I just wonder if we're not going through a period where this managerial state, as it's been defined, is going extinct.
Josh Manchester is one of our favorite investors in venture capital. He invested in the first round of SpaceX and Anduril, Flexport, and many others. Please enjoy this conversation with Josh Manchester.
Right after I left TrueBridge, I had a very opportunistic way to put $1 million into SpaceX. And this was in early 2014. Via a friend, another manager who was at the time an approved ROFR buyer, one of only a handful of ROFR buyers who, gave me this allocation, which was very nice of him. I was basically visiting with him, hanging out, complaining about something, and he said, "Wow, man, that totally sucks. Would you like $1 million of SpaceX?" Nice. I was like, "Yeah, thank you. That's very nice of you." And so I wrote up a long memo, and I did a ton of research. Actually, I'd known of the business for a while. And I did, but I cold called some rocket scientists who had worked there and things like that, and rounded up the capital. And I needed a way to hold other people's money. So Champion Hill started
Nice.
just as this entity, just to hold SpaceX, and not exactly sure what it was going to be. And then over the next 2 or 3 years, 2014 through 17. I did a couple more investments. The following year, I found a company called Flexport, which I got to know via a friend, and they had raised a seed round, and it really resonated with me because I felt like nobody in Palo Alto understands logistics, global logistics. It's just totally off the radar of that crowd, and
they have an office right there.
Yes, they have a worldwide footprint now. And I wanted to meet the Flexport guys, and they were like, "Well, we're in Asia right now." And I was like, "It just so happens, this was super random, it just so happened I had a trip to Hong Kong planned for a consulting thing I was working on." And so I said, "Well, I'm actually going to be in Hong Kong." They're like, "Oh, great, we're in Hong Kong." So I met Ryan Peterson and Ben Braverman at a speakeasy on a Monday night in Hong Kong.
Nice. Very nice.
In early 2015. And I introduced them after that to Trey Stevens of Founders Fund, who they led the Series A. And then I tagged along. I got to know, I invested in Flexport ultimately a few times. And then, and then I joined the team at Foundation Capital the following year. I live in North Carolina, and they created a role for me where I didn't have to move. So I was one of 9 on the team, but I didn't have to move, which was quite nice of them. So I went out to the Bay Area every other week or so. And that was a great experience. I did that for about 18 months, kind of like getting a PhD in early stage investing. And I, over the course of that period of time, I realized, hey, I don't think moving to the Bay Area is right for me for various reasons. And secondly, I think quite differently than a lot of Sand Hill Road firms. And so I think I just need to build something myself. And so in the summer of 17, I raised a tiny little bit of working capital from 2 guys to keep the lights on, to take Champion Hill, this SPV entity that had done 3 or 4 random things, and kind of turn it into a business. Mm-hmm. And so that was about 7 years ago. And today I think I've made 65 investments all in the last 10 years, something like that. Right after, doing that, after leaving Foundation and going on my own, about a month later, I invested in Anduril in the first round. I'd gotten to know Trey quite well. I'd actually done a lot of brainstorming around defense. I have a defense background, and he had an intelligence background. And one of his conclusions, I had a bunch of crazy ideas, but one of his was, I want to go start a new defense systems integrator. This was in 2015 or 16. And then he called me up, that summer and said, "Hey man, I'm doing it." I was like, "Oh, and you can invest." I was like, "Oh, great. It sounds good." He said, and also, I got Palmer on board. I was like, "Oh, okay. Who's that again?" I didn't really, I wasn't really tracking on who Palmer was. I was like, "Okay, fantastic."
He was like the random Facebook Oculus.
Yeah, I was like, okay, got it. Makes sense. Yeah. Sure. Whatever you say, buddy. And but obviously Palmer's a phenomenal dude. So yeah, we invested in Anduril's seed round in kind of late 2017, and I'm rambling on. I'll pause.
Amazing. So many rabbit trails there.
Yes.
Tell me about the name. Why did you choose Champion Hill? What's Champion Hill?
Yeah, Champion Hill. So the Battle of Champion Hill was in 1863 in central Mississippi, about 10 miles from where I grew up. Mm-hmm. I grew up in Raymond, Mississippi, which is a phenomenal little town. Still going strong. I mean, it's a little sleepy, but it's got great stuff happening there. And Raymond had a Civil War battle in 1863 as part of Grant's Vicksburg campaign. So, he tried to cross the Mississippi River 7 times in 7 different places, failed, succeeded on the 7th time, way south of Vicksburg, came northeast towards Jackson, hit Raymond. There was a battle there, went on to Jackson, burned it to the ground, turned left, and then went towards Vicksburg, and all the Confederates came out from Vicksburg and met at Champion Hill. That was the decisive battle of the whole campaign. Then he went on and laid siege to Vicksburg for like 6 weeks. And anyway, so as a kid growing up, there's an old pre-Civil War courthouse in Raymond that was used as a hospital. There's an Episcopal church that still has blood stains on the floor that was used as a hospital. There's a graveyard. I used to ride my bike and look at tombstones there. And now today there's actually a great little military battlefield park if you're ever visiting central Mississippi. Nice. So Champion Hill was sort of a decisive place and battle for that entire campaign. Plus it sounds good.
It sounds awesome.
So I was like, it was actually my old man's idea. I needed a name for this thing. He was like, "Why don't you go with this?" And I was like, "That's a good idea." So that's where it comes from.
That's awesome. What did you want to do when you were growing up? When you were young, what did you think you were going to do when you grew up?
Yeah. When I was 9 years old, I wanted to be a truck driver and live in Montana.
Nice.
I just want to see the whole country. I was like, that's a great way to see the whole country, And Montana seemed very, very far away. And then I thought I wanted to be an astronaut for a while. I went to space camp. I got to, I think by the time I was in high school, I don't know that I had a strong particular drive that I wanted. I had a strong drive, but I wasn't sure what I wanted to be necessarily. But then I got to college, and my best friend from home had gone to West Point and left 6 weeks earlier than me for college, because that's how it works for beast summer or whatever it is. And so I got to school, and I was like, I think it's always been in the back of my mind that I'll be in the military, but it's been like this kind of subconscious or unconscious thing. And so I said, I think that's what I want to do. I think that's what I'm supposed to do. And I went around, I was at Duke, and Duke had all 3 services, ROTC, units there. And I visited all 3. I visited the Army, the Air Force, and the Navy. And the Navy, I thought, okay, this has the most options. You can drive ships, you can fly planes, you can be underwater in submarines, or you can join the Marines. And so I'll join Naval ROTC. And then within about a month, I was like, okay, the Marine Corps is for me. That's where I'm supposed to be. These are my people. This resonates with me. And so I ended up joining Naval ROTC, and then I got a scholarship a couple of years later, and went in the Marine Corps when I finished at Duke. Yeah.
That's cool. I mean, I got to say, last time we hung out in North Carolina, there's no other VC I can think of who would ruck before a meeting, which is pretty sick. They're like, hey man, just gotta go home and shower. I was just rucking, weighing my back for a few miles, which is awesome. I love rucking. Rucking's sick.
I did do like 5 miles that day.
Yeah, that's great. It's awesome. But usually it's like, I'm sorry, I met berries or pickleball or whatever.
Well, that's the benefit of not being in San Francisco, Miami, or wherever. You're doing your own thing.
Yes.
That's right. That's right.
Question on the investing side. So you talk about, you obviously have very good judgment in terms of defense companies.
That's the nicest thing anybody's said in a while.
Yeah.
That's nice to say.
How much do you think in this business is like access oriented in terms of being in the right space to get into deals versus judgment in terms of picking out which deals you should actually place money in?
Yeah. Well, I think at the earliest stage, it is both. I think, the way I think about it is I try to develop sort of points of view about a particular space or just an idea around a quote unquote space that is not really a space yet. It could just be, I think what I have on my website, which is brand new, I'm proud of it, is, big problems hiding in plain sight. Right. And so I try to think through what are those? What does that look like? And then just socialize that thinking with friends. Whether it's like you guys or other investors, just broad network, just in conversations. As an investor, as a venture investor, you're constantly talking to people, right? You're constantly meeting new people. And so I try to think through like what are interesting, just intellectual signals to be in. And then just see what the founders in those zip codes, first of all, if there are any founders. Mm-hmm. And then if there are, like, what are they most excited about? The founders of companies are where the rubber meets the road, who are doing all the hard work and heavy lifting. Mm-hmm. And so, if you're doing it right, and I do not get it right most of the time, but if you're doing it right, then you get to a sort of intellectual place a little bit before everybody else does.
Right.
Yeah. And so is that access? Kind of. Is it judgment? Yes. But if you do it right, you get there a little bit before everybody else. I mean, maybe it's 6 months before, maybe it's, 2 years will be a lot in the way this business works, right?
Gotcha.
But that's how I think about it. Now, later stage, the later you go, the more it's about access. Mm-hmm. The more it's about access.
Because everybody already knows that it's a big hit.
Everybody knows what has hype and what might have momentum.
Right.
And so later stage, I think you have to figure out, is the hype valid while also having the ability to invest in the first place.
Right.
Right. So, but I think early stage, just very, very early investing appeals to me the most because it's where it's the least quantifiable. Mm-hmm. There's no metrics. Sure, you can go look at TAM sizes and come to conclusions there. You can go look at ideas around business models and what types of terminal margins they might have, things like that. But that's all speculative until the business gets built, and so there's no metrics to underwrite. Right. And so there being no metrics to underwrite. Once there are metrics to underwrite, everybody's got a metric underwriter.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Like analyst talent to crunch numbers. I used to be one long ago. Uh-huh. You sit in the cube and crunch the numbers. Yeah. And that's great. But I like being in a space where there's nothing like that, very little like that to look at, and it's driven by a number of other factors that are nice. Far more intangible.
Yeah. So ideally, you do some independent thinking.
Yes.
Write out your thoughts, socialize it, and then that sort of creates the environment where you end up finding the people who are also on that page, who are interested in those things.
Who may be like one notch off.
Right.
Where but there's enough in common. You've just shown up in the right place, right?
But the timing aspect, you also can't be 10 years early.
Yeah, I don't think that would work unless you have, essentially an unlimited balance sheet and unlimited conviction, right?
Right.
It works for a founder. I don't know if it works for an investor. Yeah, maybe, but I don't know.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Do you have any? We were talking about a startup earlier at breakfast, and you were kind of getting into some of how you think about investments. But are there any sort of like frameworks or things you look for, like rules of thumb that you've kind of developed over your time?
I mean, acuity of a pain point, right? How acute is the pain point that the founders are trying to solve, which can tell you a lot about whether their ideas or solutions are incremental or not. I think acuity of the pain point in the product is really important. But then I also think the team and understanding the team and just understanding their pedigree. I don't necessarily mean academic pedigree. I mean, maybe that's important depending on what they're doing. But, are they autodidacts? Does that work for what they're doing?
Right.
Almost everybody in crypto is autodidactic, right?
You can't be like a medical autodidact.
Yeah, it's less likely. I mean, I have a couple founders that fall in this bucket, but it's less likely that if you're going to have all three phases of clinical trial risk that you're going to, not have gone to college, right? Although it's not impossible. But you just have to be aware of that dynamic and be comfortable with it. But then, why have they arrived at this place? Why are they starting the company? Why do they want to do this for the next 10 to 20 years? Because if it's going to work, it's going to take that long, right? The things that don't work, generally speaking, come to fruition much faster, right? When you get a low order outcome, that's, a couple, 3, 4 years, 5 years in maybe. But if you get a big outcome, that might be 12 years, right, from today, when you're talking to them and they haven't raised a dime, or longer. And so, can they hit that long ball? Can they scale into that type of leader manager? Do they have that level of vision? Do they have, if they're highly mimetic in their thinking, the answer is often no. If they're sort of chasing a theme because they think it's easy to raise money for it, the answer is often no. And so, how long are they willing to labor in obscurity, or how long have they labored in obscurity? Right? It could be better if they have labored in obscurity, but now it's the right time where it's about to take off. But not everything always works that way. I think one of the best things to ask yourself, though, as an early stage investor, is should I quit my job and join them, right? Which is such a great proxy for so many other things. Like, should I actually just shut Champion Hill down? I'll put it in wind down mode and join these guys, right? Because the chemistry's there. I think the opportunity is big enough where this is great, but I'm going to go do that. I actually think they're capable of exploiting the size of the opportunity in front of them. That's one of the best metrics, right? And obviously, the longer you go in time, the better your own judgment at answering that question gets. But you probably shouldn't write the check if you wouldn't at least contemplate, maybe I'll just go do biz dev for those guys, or whatever you could do for them, right?
Yeah, that level of excitement is a good indicator.
Yeah. So.
Yeah, that makes sense. Are there any traits of founders you've invested in that have surprised you, and you can name or not name any names, but or any things that you've been like, man, this guy, there's one thing I learned about founders from this founders that I like from this one person that I invested in that I wasn't looking for.
Yeah. I don't know if there is a clean answer to that one.
Because at least in our much smaller experience than yours, but there are motifs that you can trace across all the founders we've invested. And in some cases, we've co-invested with you, which is a lot of fun. But obviously, each founder is unique. They have a unique background or perspective on the world. Even the fact that they chose whatever it is, defense over AI or AI over defense or the other. There's that sense of resourcefulness across all of them, whatever you might describe it. But then there's like, man, this guy's uniquely capable of doing this one mission and not that one, and that guy's uniquely capable. Like, I don't know. Any thoughts come to mind there?
Yeah. Like, I mean, I don't know. I could tell so many stories about founders and why they fit. I don't know that any of them help me answer your question well, but, ZBiotics, the ZBiotics CEO, Zach, ZBiotics makes a hangover preventive probiotic, right? Which sounds like a toy. It sounds like snake oil, to be honest, when they were first starting. But I was like, okay, I think this guy's actually, I think he can sell. I think he has charisma in a good way, the right kind of charisma. And that's kind of rare for somebody with a PhD in molecular biology, or I suspect it's rare. And I called his dissertation advisor, and she said, yeah, he was one of 25 of all 25 PhDs I've ever mentored. And I was like, okay, so he knows his space, cold. He knows his space cold, but then he's gone and figured out a way to make this interesting consumer product for this problem that, again, is hiding in plain sight that millions of people have all the time. And then also that was just one product idea, and he had multiple others, the second of which they just released in the last 30 days, which turns sugar into fiber in your stomach, which is quite interesting. And so I thought, like, I think he does have the right background for what he wants to go build here. But again, I don't know that it really helps answer your question.
Yeah. Well, a different kind of question. Maybe you don't want to spill the alpha, but are there problems in plain sight that you've identified that no one's taken on yet, where you want companies to exist or build? Yeah.
So there's two sort of thematic places. I try to develop, like I said, I try to develop interesting thematic sort of intellectual zip codes where I think there could be a big company or big companies to be built. And then I just go and try to hang out in that zip code, metaphorically speaking. And, defense and hard tech was something that we talked about several years ago, and now it's turned into, it is trying to turn into a category. Defense is trying to turn into a category. So we'll see how that plays out. But within that space, we do have an investment in a company called True Anomaly, which is an orbital warfare business. They're building hardware and software for the Space Force and for other U.S. space agencies just to defend space, which sounds, if you're not used to thinking about that stuff, it sounds nuts. It sounds crazy if you are unfamiliar with that world. But we actually think, going a bit beyond True Anomaly, we think one of the more interesting places in defense today, where we're spending some time to have more of a prepared mind, is just extended and continued military uses of space. Like, there's this entire commercial space ecosystem today, which, being honest, we feel like is overinvested, has attracted too much capital. But most of those, many of those investors, well, I don't want to say anything about the investors, but just like that domain, it feels like a gaping hole is the knowledge of military aspects of space, which we think is quite important. Now, is there another company to be built that is not True Anomaly? We don't know yet. But I'd say we're really interested in talking to founders who have either built something for the Space Force, have been in the Space Force, or who have been in the part of the Air Force that became the Space Force, or who used to be in the NRO, or who maybe have experienced selling to the parts of the government that do military or intelligence work in space. That's a huge area of interest for us today. We also have we have a company called Umbra, which makes radar satellites and is doing phenomenally well. We've invested in Umbra 4 times now. We think it's going to be a very large company, and that's more on the, they're doing more on the intelligence side than on the military side. But so, I think one thing we're really interested in finding today are there other companies that we think can be very large, that have to do with military uses in space. If you think about it, if the base case for the next 5 years is we're going to have a moon base, right? That's not the upside case. That's the base case. That budget's already there. It's already being planned. It's already being.
It's the budget for who? For the U.S. government?
Well, Artemis is going to be from NASA. SpaceX is planning on it, figuring out how to supply it.
So somebody's going to put a base on the moon.
There's going to be American assets on the moon again.
What are the immediate benefits of that?
Probably humans.
Josh loves space.
I am bearish on space. Unlike deep space, I love all the orbital stuff. I think makes total sense. People who I think the Mars stuff and mining asteroids is a little bit doesn't pencil out. But.
Well, it doesn't pencil out yet,
but
it will. And I think that future in which it does, the moon is a stepping stone. The moon's a stepping stone to that. So, but let's assume there's zero value to being on the moon, commercial. Let's just assume that for the sake of conversation. The Chinese are there, and the Chinese are doing things on the far side of the moon that we can't actually surveil. And so just knowing what they're doing is valuable. And then, I am quite bullish on Mars, on going to Mars. But I guess rather than having a debate on is this a good idea or not, I think it's better to just say it's going to happen with the funding and ambition and other things that have been set in place. And then to point out that if it does happen, those places have to be defended, right? And that's just extremely interesting. And then the Space Force itself, setting aside anything, having to do with the moon or Mars, the Space Force itself, I think when it started, people thought it was kind of a joke. It was they probably put it in the same bucket as Trump saying he wants to buy Greenland.
Well, I was going to say, didn't Trump start it? I think maybe that's why it was
100%
positioned as a joke.
100%. And there was a movie made about it, a spoof movie.
Yeah.
But no, it's a big deal because when you have entire regions of the globe where our adversaries have structured their militaries where they can completely deny our existing assets access to that region, orbit is a way to achieve access, right? Mm-hmm. For whatever it is you're trying to accomplish, whether it's surveillance, delivery of effects of some kind, eventually perhaps logistics, we'll see.
Yeah.
So I think the Space Force is probably the most undervalued of the military forces. And
we did talk to a founder recently who I agree with this assessment, and I can't go into all the details here, but essentially talk about how there's a domain, land is the domain in warfare that we've sort of mastered, and water as well.
Entirely new domain.
And as you go higher, it's an unmastered and entirely new, and the possibilities for flexible approaches to that battle space are so different.
Yes. Totally. It would be very tricky and dangerous in a conflict with China, for example, for the U.S. military to push surface ships forward in that conflict. Those are targets, and those are targets that the Chinese can range and destroy faster and earlier or they can do it sooner and for a cheaper price than, for example, an aircraft carrier and carrier-launched aviation can attrit and respond land-based cruise missiles. And so if you're going to counter that threat, you need other types of counters, which could be, which will be bombers flying from the U.S., stealthy in nature. But you could also have space-based effects of various kinds that would help you counter that. I mean, part of the counter, effects aside, part of the counter is just space-based assets identifying land-based transporter erector launchers on the mainland so that B2s and B1s can hit them. And so I think it's just underappreciated. You see a lot of press in the U.S. around like, oh my God, the Chinese have more ships than us or whatever. And I don't think we need to be investing in more ships. I think it'd be great if the ships we have didn't have all these maintenance problems and staffing problems. But I don't think we need a 600 ship Navy. That's fighting the last war, and it's putting our weakness against their strength. They have, 200 times the shipbuilding capacity that we have. But we can sink their entire Navy with bomber launched munitions, which are far cheaper.
And so, building a whole Navy.
Yeah. So let them build a large Navy and use their assets on it, which we then attrit with the Air Force.
Yeah. You do wonder if we're at a point where it's like the British Navy was when it was all a huge Navy, and then the tech progresses, and all of a sudden that entire force is not a factor.
Yeah, you don't
paper boats. Yeah,
you don't necessarily. If you're the Chinese, you don't even necessarily need a huge Navy to affect a blockade of Taiwan, right? You can do it with land-based cruise missiles. You say we're setting up a snap quarantine zone around Taiwan. Any container ship that enters these sets of grid squares, or however you phrase it, is going to get hit with a missile and sunk. And you maybe don't have to fire any, but if you do, you maybe have to do one or two before everybody gets the message. Now those missiles are being launched from land-based assets, and so if the chess game then for the United States becomes, okay, we're not technically in a shooting war yet, but in order to stop what they're doing, we now have to hit the mainland China, and these missile launchers could be hiding in locations that are even far more dense in population than where we're sitting right now, right? And so, having more ships in that scenario does not necessarily help you.
Do you think a Taiwan-Chinese conflict is likely? And how much, as you're thinking about investments, are you trying to forecast sort of geopolitical shifts that would play into that?
Well, we're not trying to forecast. So is it likely? I don't know. I mean, it is a stated goal of the Chinese Communist Party to take Taiwan back and be reunited by 2049, right? And so I think of it as like there being several clocks ticking. That's one clock that ticks. Another clock that ticks is Xi's 71 years old. So how long does he think he has before he goes for immortal glory, as he defines it, right? Being the guy who, brought the wayward provinces back in line after the century of humiliation, et cetera, et cetera. And then another clock ticking is just, some of the individual net assessment type things in that region. Like the B-21 is quite revolutionary, but it's going to be another 3, 4, 5 years before we have any. And that can change the balance a little bit there. But so I don't make prognostications on whether it's going to happen. It's likely, whatever. But I do think it's something that has to be deterred. Like China has to be deterred. That's how this works. You create enough uncertainty on their side that they're not sure that they should go for it, and that comes from their analysis of our capabilities, our willpower, et cetera. And so, from our perspective, investing in defense, we look at defense investing through the lens of the Pacific theater, right? We see that as being the most acute pain point for the U.S. military today. And within that, it has other miniature acute pain points. So we have not. Now, some of our companies, they make things that can be used in other theaters as well, of course. And Ukraine, the war in Ukraine is going on as well. But the things that you might want to invest in that could assist the Ukrainians or tip the balance there are not necessarily the things you'd want to invest in that the U.S. military needs in the Pacific, which again, we think is the most acute pain point for U.S. defense. And just to give some examples, not about specific, platforms, but just to do a quick compare and contrast, if the distances are quite small in the Russia-Ukraine war. The distances are quite small. And the geography is quite different. So if the three of us decided that we wanted to go to Kiev, we could be there tomorrow,
Right.
And or other places. If there's a war between China and Taiwan, nobody's getting to Taipei. We're not even sure we're going to get Marines to Taipei, right? Mm-hmm. And so that's just one easy example. But the distances are vast. The distances in the Pacific are much, much more vast. If you've ever flown from Tokyo to Australia or Singapore to Tokyo, that's equivalent. Just that distance is equivalent of, Singapore to Tokyo is equal to maybe a little longer than New York to London, right?
Wow.
And that's just a small piece of it. And so there's just a ton of differences. We think the Pacific is the most acute pain point today. It may not be over a 10-year period. There's this great chart I like from, I think it was a General Mattis chart from a long time ago, where he just goes through every decade of the 20th century and what defense strategists were mainly worried about at the beginning of that decade. And in every case, they were totally wrong. What ended up happening and what ended up really kicking everyone in the nuts was something totally different than what they were planning for. So
yeah, even if you build a Maginot line and then
and
go around it.
And so I think it's absolutely worthwhile to worry about China, deterring China. I think it's going to be a problem for a long period of time. If Xi dies, we don't know who his successor will be. Maybe it's a successor who says, "Hey, man, you triggered a trade war with America. You ended up isolating us from the rest of the world. Blah blah. All these problems." However, and then maybe the successor is modestly more comfortable with dealing with the West on a different set of terms. However, the Chinese are still going to keep investing in a military force, right? And you have to think about deterrence in terms of capabilities, not intent. Capabilities and not intent. Right now, they're building capabilities and they have some intent. Maybe the intent changes, the capabilities will still be there, and it takes much longer to invest in capabilities to counter those capabilities than it does if their intent changes overnight. You say, "Oh wow, now we gotta." So you have to deter despite those changes. So I think where am I going with this? As a contrarian, you have to wonder: is the common knowledge wrong as it was throughout the 20th century in many places? I think China's going to be a problem for a while, right? I think it's a 10, 20 year type problem to deter.
Yeah.
Or longer.
Yeah. G.K. Chesterton has a good essay about how successful prophets are wrong. Exactly what you're saying. If you're a really successful prophet, then you actually deter the thing that you're.
Or who's the most successful military strategist of all time? Nobody knows. Right? Because he didn't have to fight a war.
Yes.
Yeah. You say China's still a major threat. I've seen headlines recently, people talking about, population collapse for China. There was a chart going around recently about the dearth of startups in recent years. Does that affect how you think about China? Or you think despite those things, it's still going to be the momentum is strong enough?
The momentum's strong. Look, they have a lot of problems. Right? they have a lot of problems because it's essentially planned dictatorship, right? Extraordinary human capital, extraordinary drive when that was all unleashed, but then it was tapped back down again, and they weren't without issues in the period from call it 95 to 2010. There were tons of issues, but that was probably one of the biggest just absolute waves of change from capitalism that has ever happened, and maybe that will ever happen. But yeah, they have a lot of problems. I mean, demographics is a big problem. I mean, people have been saying for years that China will grow old before it becomes rich, right? And that has basically happened, or is happening. But look, you have a lot of very smart, talented people, and yeah, who knows the ways in which a collapsing economy or demographic changes or political infighting influences their foreign policy decisions, right? Very difficult to predict. And so you just have to deter. You have to deter. You have to say, stay in your box, or it's going to be a bad day for everybody. Yeah. And I think it's wildly in U.S. interest to do that for Taiwan. I think the U.S. will defend Taiwan even if the Taiwanese aren't sure about it, because it has to do with credibility, both broadly, but also to the Japanese, to the South Koreans. I mean, there's you could easily have two more nuclear powers there within like a 6-month time frame, and that is not necessarily in anybody's best interest. You could flirt with that idea and say maybe it is, but maybe not. And so, I think then the amount of world trade that goes through that area is, I think greater on an absolute basis than we have with Europe, right? So I think the U.S. will defend Taiwan, in just about any scenario.
We've talked about the sort of zoomed into China and defense in that potential conflict. Zooming out though, defense industry, like an OG defense investor, that used to be not just like you said earlier, it's kind of becoming a category. Trey wrote a great piece on Pirate Wires, whatever it was, over the summer, talking about the dangers of defense investing as a category now. But it used
10 years ago, it was taboo.
That's my point. It was, so I was going to say, it was not even a category. It was like morally wrong. At least that was sort of the sense in Silicon Valley, that you just do not touch weapons or shields or anything that's projecting force in a military capacity out. Talk a little bit about that from the early stages and the shift as you've seen it happening.
Yeah. I was in the Marine Corps for 6 years, all in, and had a number of really just interesting. I had a lot of operational experience in the Marines, and then I started a new career, ended up in a venture role, and started to realize, well, like nobody in the Bay Area seems to know anything about defense or national security. Even Palantir, like people weren't even sure. I remember people thought Palantir was some sort of scam, some sort of weird scam, because they didn't talk to anybody else. And they hadn't raised money from any like normie venture capitalists, right, in the early days.
Like you couldn't go say, A16Z didn't exist at the time, I guess, but you couldn't say, A16Z's on the cap table, because they weren't. Yeah, nobody knew who Founders Fund really was, and Peter was a Republican, so they didn't like him anyway. And so, and then from my perspective, I knew a lot about defense, about national security, and so for a few years in my career, like that was sort of a filter that I had for evaluating deals. That was a little subconscious, but like even with SpaceX, I think I wrote 10 years ago that
it could be a very valuable company if the U.S. and China end up in an arms race, right? Which is what has happened. But I don't think anybody was just. I'm not trying to say I'm so smart or whatever. I just don't think people had that filter. Other participants, not many other participants in the market had that type of filter. Whereas for me, it was just like second nature, and I think defense broadly, people would say over the years, oh, we can't invest in defense, we can't invest in weapons. There's still a bunch of those out there. Even I would try to like say, I'll also say, 5 years ago, 4 to 7 years ago, there wasn't much to invest in.
Sure.
There wasn't much to invest in defense-wise of high quality, of venture scale, right? That could be big enough that you need to see in this asset class. And then when you would talk about defense, people would kind of look at you funny, and they weren't really sure why that'd be interesting. And then after people started investing in defense, they still stick to, we're only going to do dual use. I mean, I advertised that back in the day myself. I'd say like dual use is sort of like defense is a filter you can put over all of deep tech, which is true. And then dual use is like a spectrum where you can have 100% defense on one side, where you're building weapons. And then on the other side, you have something that's mainly commercial, but maybe they can have the DoD as a customer one day if they want to, but it's not even really on their roadmap now, But actually, that's not the way to invest in the space at all. The way to invest in the space at all is look for weapons, because I'm generalizing a little bit, but that's what the U.S. has needed more of. I mean, there's other things too, but the U.S. has needed that, and other firms are a little antsy about it still. Not all of them. I mean, there's tons that are happily investing in weapons, like we are. But many firms will say, "Oh, we're only going to invest in defensive technology," which doesn't make any sense. It doesn't make any sense. Almost anything that's defensive can be used for offense. So it just doesn't. It shows sort of a naive point of view, or they're just saying what their LP base wants to hear. And then people have often blamed, we have these, terms in our LP agreements, blah, blah. And maybe that's true. I don't know. But I always think when I hear that, I bet the Chinese don't have this problem. I bet the Chinese capital markets and Chinese ecosystem don't have this problem of, elite university X only doesn't want to invest in the technologies that preserve the freedom of speech that they supposedly rely upon to have freedom of thought and, tenured academics who can, think outside the box and develop new ideas, yada, 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 yada. Yeah. So anyways, I do think maybe it's a little taboo, but it's just like off everybody's radar a few years ago. And when I raised my most recent fund, one of my large investors beforehand, he said, look, why don't you just put the next fund all in defense? And this was in late 21. And I said, I honestly don't think there's enough great deals.
Yeah.
and that has changed. And so you fast forward today, that fund is probably 60 or 70% defense. It's more than I would have expected, for sure. And they're very high quality things. But I'm still not so sure that there's enough of high enough quality, to bet the whole farm on over multiple, funds or a whole cycle, you can say. And so I think it has like these interesting tailwinds now, which is great. It's great for America. But we continue to spend a lot of time there. We spend time in other places too. So.
Yeah. What are some of the areas you guys are thinking about outside of defense?
Yeah. So I'll give two. I have a thematic bucket, which I just call curveballs,
Nice.
which is just things that don't fit in buckets. And my LPs give me a lot of latitude there. They give me enough rope with which to hang myself. but it allows for some idea generation. And so probably about 2 years ago, I got really interested in population decline. I have this book. So I started like looking into it, reading about it. And I had read some books about demographics and investing years before. But you start seeing the stats on TFR and things like that. And it's very interesting. So I was like, this is very interesting. This is a big deal. This could be a big problem. And I have this book called Global Catastrophic Risk, which not something to read right before bedtime.
Great title.
Yeah, exactly. Well, it's by the Bostrom superintelligence crowd, right? I read superintelligence years ago. I was like, that's pretty good. What else have they written? And I bought this just like anthology. And if you go through this book, like all the different ways that human civilization could end, right? Population decline is not in there. And I'm like, that's very interesting.
When was this written?
Probably, I don't know, 5, 6, 7 years ago.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's recent enough that you'd think they would have included that.
And so then in the course of investigating this topic, I met an academic who had interned there at the place that wrote the book, the Oxford Institute of Future of Humanity, which has now been shut down, I think. And he told me, they know that's a problem, but it's too taboo to put in the book. And I was like,
whoa.
Bingo.
Flashing neon lights.
Bingo. And so now, obviously, how do you invest in that, right? Because it's so multifaceted and it has so many different pieces to it. But we have made 2 investments, one of which is in stealth mode I can't talk about, and it's deeply scientific in nature. And they'll come out maybe later this year. But the other one you guys have had on the podcast, Keeper.
Yes.
There's only total opposite end of the spectrum. It's consumer facing.
Right.
And Keeper is meant to, my words, not theirs, burn all dating apps to the ground because they're ruining society and making everyone miserable, and create a structure instead where you find somebody you're supposed to settle down with and have kids, right? Again, that's not explicit on Keeper's website, but that's my thesis.
And one of our colleagues is...
There we go. Yeah.
He's now married through Keeper.
there have been Keeper marriages, yes. And the first Keeper baby has been born.
Amazing. There you
go. But so I think it's a really interesting problem. I think it will increase. I think it has increased in mind share. People are talking about it more over the last couple of years. I think it's going to increase even more in mind share. I mean, even in the election conversation, right? Like Trump's come out and said the government should pay for IVF, right? Which is like very interesting. I think could be a great idea. It has the risk of politicizing that whole process, which could be a big problem. But yeah, I think it's multifaceted because it gets into things like housing and the cost of education, different ways around how you structure your life. Certainly, women and their how they organize their lives around working and so forth. And I think it's really interesting. I think if you try to distill it down to like a pithy question or a pithy statement, it would be that middle class or upper middle class families and parents spend so many just enormous amounts of resources on academics and college prep, right? For this industrial grade college entrance arms race that our society has created. And I think they spend, relative to that, on a comparative basis, very little bandwidth around the question, am I going to be a grandparent one day? Am I going to have grandchildren? And if you were to just not even invert those, but just like raise that question, it starts to have these interesting knock-on second and third order effects around different things you try to, different ideas you introduce to your kids, how you position them in certain activities versus others, maybe even how you think about college altogether, right? Like, it would be very interesting. You can see TFR stats on a country basis, maybe even in the US, maybe like a 50 state basis. It'd be very interesting to see TFR stats on a college basis, right? Like what's the most fertile college in America? And then I think like there are folks who talk about this problem who they're way on one end of the side, one side where they're like, we need to have 7 kids or we need to have 10 kids or whatever, which probably scares a lot of people away from the problem. But it's actually much simpler than that. Like if everybody who had 2 kids just had 3, there wouldn't be a problem.
Right.
No. But I don't mean to be flippant about that, right? Like obviously that's a huge thing. It's investment of time. It's planning ahead. It's like how you structure your life. And so I just think it's really interesting. And I also think there's one other strand here that is also very interesting. I mean, there's definitely a strand of thinking in these circles that people who study population and so forth. There's a strand of thinking that IQ is declining globally at 0.2, 0.3 points per year, which over a 75-year period is a standard deviation, right? Which is the difference between, it's big. And that's a problem. And if you start to think through that, well, going back to colleges and TFR, right? There's this idea, this has been around a while, the idea that major cities are what's called IQ shredders, right?
Yes.
I mean, you have to ask, how is that not true? It seems like it's true.
Can you explain IQ shredders for folks who might not know what it is?
Yeah.
I think it's a real thing.
I think it's a real, it's a real thing. So the idea is that the most capable, intelligent people end up heading to the largest cities in the world. Let's pick on New York, London, and San Francisco. And once they're there, they are extremely dedicated to their careers. The opportunities for them in their careers are the largest that they are anywhere on the planet. Like the upside for them is uncapped, and then their opportunities to just have an interesting life also very interesting. Like you have all the arts in the world, all the thinkers, all the whatever your thing is, restaurants, theater, whatever it is, it's all there. Your dating life can be, as varied and interesting as you want it to be, right? And so what ends up happening is, as a male, you end up in your 40s and you don't have kids. And as a female, you end up in your 30s and you don't have kids. You haven't settled down. And, maybe some people are perfectly happy with that, and that's fine. I get the sense that many people are not happy with that. And so by the time that this, strata of society that is like the most capable, the most intelligent, et cetera, are settling down, it's very difficult for them to have children. And, they maybe struggle to have kids. They have fewer than they would if they hadn't waited so long. I mean, because there are biological things here that happen for women and men around the ease of having kids. And so, I mean, I don't know. I guess I'd be interested to hear a Steelman opposite argument that that's not happening. I think it is. And so, this is just something that I've been spending a lot of time thinking about. Yeah.
How do you keep, we've mentioned both the breakfast and here, mimetic thinking and wanting to avoid, like venture, especially startups, tend to be such mimetic gravity wells, you know? FOMO is just like a drug that just everybody's on. And so what things do you do not to be on that drug? You obviously live in North Carolina, you're not in the Bay Area. Yeah. We're in Dallas, we're not in the Bay Area, so that helps a lot. But reading, writing, like rucking? Like, what things do you do that make you not a creature, just another creature of the blob?
Yeah.
That is tech and venture, but an app for a person with perspective on the industry as a whole.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah, being physically distant does help, although it has downsides as well. But there is, the Bay Area can be like a little bit of a self-licking ice cream cone in terms of its hype cycles and fads and so forth. I think one technique is to sort of know the Bay Area reasonably well, and then just say, what's taboo in California? What's taboo out there? And then that leads you down interesting paths, right? Like, almost nobody in Palo Alto has ever swung a hammer in their lives. So maybe anything that has to do with blue collar labor is quite interesting.
Right. Yeah.
But I think it doesn't always work, right? But I think in terms of idea generation, I think I tend to just think if I'm looking for areas where either there's a chance that I'm the best in the world at investing in it, which is maybe defense, maybe there's a chance there that might be my firm, or nobody's the best in the world, like unclear. Just give an example, because this is an area we're not going to spend a lot of time in. But who's the best medical device investor on planet Earth today? I don't know. If you ask people who are starting a device company, say, who's your aspirational lead for your pre-seed round? They're not sure, so that's interesting, right? I went on this quest last year to figure out who the best semiconductor investors are in venture today. Because like when I started in this asset class, every big firm had like a guy who was the semiconductor guy. NEA had a guy, and Battery Ventures had a guy, and pick a famous old school firm. They had their semiconductor guy, and all those guys are retired, right? Meanwhile, we hear all the time about how important chips are, Taiwan Semiconductor this, NVIDIA that, CHIPS Act this, etc. It's like, CHIPS Act, $50 billion. Wow. How's that going to get invested? Who's going to make money from that? And I did kind of go on this quest. And I found out there are like 6 people who are quite good, and they basically collude, with each other. And now I know one of them, right? And that's good. He's the guy I'll send those things to and share them with, right? So I think like I just try to avoid anything that has a narrative to it. The narrative has often been created retrospectively after one really great company. You could have an entire space where VCs are naming their fund after the space because that's what they're going to go do, and that's their gimmick to go raise money. And you peel back the onion, the entire space is really like one great company and about 19 Me Too's that are going to go away. And that's an overstatement, but it happens. Something like that happens a lot, because I do think that success is often idiosyncratic, 0 to 1-ish. I do think there's a power law, and so if there's something out there where I find it and then I realize, oh wow, yeah, these other 5 firms that are friends of mine but maybe kind of competitive too have already invested in 3 other things just like it, then I don't know, it's probably too late.
Makes sense. Something that's been very prevalent the last decade or so, like globalism, sort of the managerial state, feels like it's been a strong force. What are your thoughts on that space?
Yeah. So what I think, I think the U.S. has gone through multiple phases of the way power is organized and exercised at the federal level, and then between the feds and the states. Mm-hmm. And the one we have had, so you could say there's been, I don't know, 3 or 4 or 5 chapters in the history of the U.S. where those things have been different in structure, despite the fact that the core substrate has been similar or the same. The Constitution and core beliefs and the core, checks and balances and so forth, separation of powers. And so I wonder, and what I've told my LP base, I wonder, are we in the midst of one of those changes, one of those periods of change where the structure that we have today is the country is really run by all manner of agencies that were started kind of in World War II through 1955, right? And then maybe a little bit after that because they just proliferate, right? But this type of organization and so forth won World War II, right? It's the reason why we've had what we've had, Pax Americana for 80 years. But nothing lasts forever. And it seems like those sort of mid-20th century structures are not ideal for the 21st century economy, number one. Number two, they're very expensive. I think the structure of U.S. spending is such that I suggest that for every federal employee who retires, that person is not going to get replaced on a one-to-one basis, right? Which implies change. And so I just wonder if we're not going through a period where this managerial state, as it's been defined, is going extinct, right? And so then what comes after it? There could be a lot of things. New founding could be one thing, right? Let's create different forms of parallel societies, right? That have a different formulation of relationship with the states in which they reside. That could be one thing. I think AI eating government headcount is absolutely going to happen.
Yes.
That's one of our co-investments.
Yep, we have a very similar view on that.
Yeah, that's one of our co-investments.
Literally bet on that together.
Yeah, we have this investment where, on the one hand, you could pencil out, okay, this is a law enforcement deal. What's law enforcement IT spend? Okay, it's an interesting size company. Great. But you could also pencil out what's law enforcement labor spend, which is about 20x bigger. And what if some of that labor spend shifts to this category of IT spend?
Yeah.
So what I'm suggesting is, what if that happens everywhere throughout multiple parts of the government, state and federal? That seems to imply a different structure of power when it has happened in enough places. It could also be quite frustrating. I mean, every time you're trying to accomplish something in your personal life and you have to go log into another portal, right?
Yes.
Like every portal you encounter, you have a SaaS investor to thank for, right? Like when you're trying to get your kids signed up for the whatever league or order the school photos or whatever it is, the portals and then you talk to people, you talk to a human, they're like, oh, you can do that on the portal.
Yes.
Or didn't you try that in the portal? It's like, didn't you get the memo about the TPS reports? This could actually be like a terrible future. But I do think that like thinking around that is interesting. And then
you will eat the bugs. You will live in the pod. You will log into the portal. Yeah, plural.
Yes. But also it could be that there are vertically integrated service providers for the government. Could be interesting as well. Now, what could that look like? I have one in my portfolio that I think is what it could look like. Can that model apply across other parts? I'm not sure. Anyways, I just think it's a very rich space in which to think and talk about today. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe there's nothing giant that you can build there, but I think it's possible, right? I guess another just two more comments. Think of your favorite government conspiracy theory, whatever it is, and then just ask yourself: is this really a conspiracy, or is it just pure incompetence? And you don't really have it doesn't really matter. Like the results are the same. The results of a conspiracy theory or incompetence with a dash of malignance are kind of the same. And in your personal life, I don't know if this has ever happened to you guys, but in your personal life, if you ever had like somebody you work with or somebody you interact with who every now and then they do something like that's very negative for you, and you're like, are they doing that on purpose? Like, are they malignant, or are they just kind of clueless? Because I can't tell. They're just kind of, they don't have like social skills or whatever. And generally speaking, in personal life, if you run across that person, you just cut them out of your life, right? And I think like most of America kind of has that view of like an incompetent government. Like, I don't know if it's incompetent or if it's malignant, but the conclusion's the same. Like, let's do it a different way, right? And then the other thought just on this topic is, if lawfare goes vertical, oh, by the way, on the incompetence piece, well, obviously that drives social trust downwards, right? But if lawfare goes vertical along any types of different axes, then that also drives social trust downwards, but it also drives execution of services downwards, right? If every county is suing the state and every state is suing the government and vice versa, like who knows what to do in any of a number of different edge cases you might encounter, if you're a cop or if you're a teacher or if you're whatever in a hospital.
The board is just set up to incentivize inaction.
Yeah, and so people will then end up making their own decisions and ignoring any sort of central authority, and then you're in a new framework, right? I mean, that's a extreme case, right? But I do think this is a worthwhile place to just spend time and think.
I guess as we wrap up, you've kind of covered it already, but any things that are in the horizon, either culturally, politically, or even in terms of technology, emerging technologies that excite you about what stuff we might see, companies or trends that we might see over the next few years?
Yeah, I think I have encountered like a small vein of founders who are sort of the intersection of genetics, advances in genetics, sometimes reproductive technology. But I think what's interesting to me about that space is, let's not call it a space. What's interesting to me about some of the things they're working on is they make people feel funny inside in different ways. If you can look at embryos and screen for the downsides, people are generally very comfortable with that. But if you're also able to screen for the upsides, people get very weirded out by that along a number of different vectors. And that weirdness that they feel is exactly what we were talking about defense, 5 years ago, 7 years ago. And I think that's an interesting, just anything that touches any of that is interesting. And then going a couple more steps, I think we're in this very interesting time where culturally you see alignment between conservative religious groups and name brand mainstream tech investors or firms. And that's really interesting to me. I think one of the takeaways from looking at population decline is that some of the most fertile groups are those that are most religious, right? But many of those same denominations or religions, whatever they might be, also eschew technology, like quite actively, or
don't actively participate in it.
Yeah, they have various different ways of adopting technological change, and I think that's just a very interesting space to spend time in, like to think through, TFR for Mormons is declining. TFR for Catholics is declining, right? and I've seen all sorts of Twitter threads on why that might be for the Mormons. It's because the CIA set up the thing. It's because all the Mormon moms go on Instagram. I've seen all these interesting things, but and who knows if any of that's real. But the point is, it is declining, and that's just very interesting. And so, if I have some friends who think about population a lot, and they arrive at a place where a community that has faith but is also technophilic is the one that's going to own the world 100 or 150 years from now. I think that's very interesting. I don't know who that is today. And they could be wrong. Maybe they're wrong. Anyways, that's just, I think that's is a worthwhile things to spend time thinking about, and that I do. And it leads to interesting conversations, which lead to deal flow.
Absolutely, man. Good stuff. Well, thanks for coming on. This was fantastic.
Yeah, thank you guys for having me.
Absolutely.
I appreciate it.
Totally.
Yeah.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the New Founding Podcast. New Founding has become a rallying point for founders and investors who are taking serious bets in the face of a stagnant business culture. Our venture fund backs founders building dynamic companies, powered by American ideals and a positive national vision. These are the kinds of founders that embody the optimism and competence of the people who come on this podcast. If you're interested in investing in our fund, check out newfounding.com/venture fund and follow the link to apply.